The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty road as I drove deeper into the unknown. It had been hours since I passed the last gas station, and the further I went, the more the trees seemed to close in around me. The winding road stretched endlessly, and I could feel the weight of isolation pressing down on me. There was something unsettling about being so far from everything familiar, but I couldn't quite place my finger on it. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the strange stillness of the landscape, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I glanced at the clock. It was just past 7 p.m., and the light was fading fast. My headlights flickered briefly, then steadied, casting a narrow beam of light on the asphalt ahead. I didn't know where I was headed, but I had to keep moving. The old map I had pulled from the glove box was practically useless in this digital age, but I'd been trying to take the back roads for the sake of some quiet, alone time. I regretted it now. There were no other cars, no signs of life. It felt like I was the last person on Earth, swallowed up by this endless stretch of highway. The trees had grown denser, their branches intertwining to form an almost impenetrable canopy above me. The road twisted like a snake, each turn revealing only more of the same. Dark woods, empty stretches, and a growing sense of unease. My phone had lost signal a while ago. No bars. Not that it mattered much. I didn't need anyone reaching out. I just didn't like being cut off from the world. I reached for my water bottle on the passenger seat, trying to distract myself from the nagging feeling creeping into my chest. Then, without warning, my headlights caught something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it clearly. A car, parked but no one inside. A rusted old sedan, its paint chipped and faded. The engine hood was slightly ajar, as if the car had broken down and the owner had just walked off, leaving everything behind. I slowed, my heart pounding in my chest, but the strange stillness of the place seemed to hold me in its grip. It was like the air had thickened. I could have passed by, kept going, but something pulled me toward it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need for a break from the endless isolation. I pulled over slowly, stopping just behind the abandoned car. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the air heavy, thick with silence. I stared at the empty sedan, wondering who had left it behind and why. I got out of my car and approached the other vehicle cautiously, scanning the surroundings. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no obvious signs that anything had happened here. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before peeking inside. The interior was old, dusty, and worn. The seat belts were frayed, the upholstery torn. It smelled faintly of something stale, like it had been abandoned for months, maybe years. But there was something else, something I couldn't place. A subtle scent, almost like a mix of damp earth and something metallic. My skin prickled. I opened the door wider, cautiously stepping inside, half expecting to find a hidden body or something that would explain the car's abandonment. But there was nothing. Nothing except the faint smell and a strange chill in the air that seemed to seep from the car itself. I stepped back, my hands trembling slightly, my mind racing with questions. Why was this car here so far from civilization? Had it broken down? Was someone lost in the woods? But as I stood there, staring at the sedan, the unsettling feeling deepened. I didn't belong here. This place, this road, felt wrong. I decided it was time to leave. Fast. But as I turned back to my car, a sound stopped me in my tracks. A rustling noise coming from the woods. I froze, every muscle tensed. The sound came again, closer this time. Branches shifting, twigs snapping. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to call out, to shout to whoever or whatever was out there, but my voice seemed to stick in my throat. Then I saw something. A figure, a shadow moving swiftly between the trees. It was tall, thin, and unnaturally fast. Too fast for a person, too erratic in its movements to be anything normal. My heart hammered in my chest. I stood frozen, watching as the shadow darted from one tree to another, its outline barely visible in the dimming light. I couldn't make out details, just the movement, and it was coming closer. I stumbled back toward my car, every instinct telling me to drive, to get out of here as quickly as possible. But as I reached the door, I hesitated. My fingers hovered over the handle, unsure. There was no one else around. No cars. No signs of civilization for miles. The shadow had stopped moving. For a long moment, the silence returned, heavier than before. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts as I tried to calm myself, to think clearly. Was it just a deer? Some animal? But then, there was that feeling again, the sense that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I slammed the car door shut and started the engine, the sound of the engine breaking the eerie quiet. The headlights flickered again, but this time they didn't settle. I had no choice but to keep going. The road ahead twisted and turned as the sky grew darker. I pushed the gas pedal harder, my mind racing. That shadow had been no animal. It had been something else, something wrong. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to stretch and blur, the endless road becoming a tunnel that closed in around me. My headlights illuminated the way, but it felt like I was driving into an abyss. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But the road behind was empty. I took another turn, and that's when I saw it. A house, a small, run-down cabin barely visible through the trees. It wasn't on any map. There were no signs, no indication that it was even there. My heart skipped a beat. This was the kind of place you read about in stories, the kind of place people get trapped in. I slowed, staring at the cabin in disbelief. There were no lights on, but the door was slightly ajar, swinging in the wind. My instincts screamed at me to keep going, to drive away and never look back. But something in my gut told me that I had to stop. Something was pulling me toward it. I parked by the side of the road and cut the engine. The night was thick around me, suffocating. My headlights illuminated the cabin, casting long shadows on the overgrown lawn. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was colder now, the silence even heavier. I approached the door slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the threshold, I hesitated. Should I go in? Should I knock? Or was this a mistake? I reached out and pushed the door open, the creaking sound loud in the quiet. The inside was dark, but there was a faint glow coming from a small oil lamp on the table. The place was dusty, abandoned. Nothing but old furniture, peeling wallpaper, and cobwebs. But there, sitting on the table, was a map of the very area I had been driving through. I walked closer, my breath caught in my throat as I examined the map. It was old, worn, and marked with strange notations, circles, lines, and strange symbols that made no sense. But then my eyes stopped on a particular mark, a spot that seemed to be near where I had turned off the main road. And then I saw it, a note, written in shaky handwriting. "You are not supposed to be here." I had been planning the hike for weeks. It was one of those bucket list trails that everyone talks about but few actually attempt. The trail wound its way deep into the wilderness, with no cell service and no signs of civilization for miles. It was just what I needed, a break from the chaos of work and the noise of the city. The weather app showed clear skies, and I packed my bag meticulously. A map, a compass, extra layers, a flashlight, plenty of water, and enough snacks to last me 2 days. Even though I planned to be back by evening. I had hiked alone before and knew the risks, but I felt prepared. I always did my homework before heading out. The trailhead was about a 2-hour drive from my apartment. I left before dawn to make the most of the daylight. By the time I parked my car and laced up my boots, the sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was crisp and cool, and the forest smelled damp and earthy from a recent rain. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the trail. The first few miles were peaceful. The path was well marked, cutting through dense trees that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. Birds chirped, and the occasional squirrel darted across the trail. I passed a few other hikers heading back to the parking lot, exchanging polite nods but no words. I noticed they were in pairs or groups. No one else seemed to be hiking alone. After about an hour, I reached a fork in the trail. One path was wider and clearly more traveled, while the other was narrow and overgrown. According to my map, the narrower trail led to a secluded overlook with a stunning view of the valley below. It was exactly the kind of spot I wanted to see, so I decided to take the less traveled path. The vegetation closed in around me as I moved deeper into the forest. The trail was barely a foot wide in places, with roots and rocks jutting out like traps waiting to trip me up. I slowed my pace, watching each step carefully. The sounds of the forest seemed to shift here. The cheerful chirping of birds was replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional creak of branches swaying in the breeze. It wasn't eerie exactly, but it felt different, like the forest was paying attention. I reached the overlook around midday. The view was breathtaking. The valley stretched out below me, a patchwork of green and gold with a river snaking through it like a silver ribbon. I sat down on a flat rock, pulled out a granola bar, and took a long drink of water. For a while, I just sat there, letting the silence settle around me. It was the kind of peace you can only find far away from people and screens and the hum of electricity. After about 20 minutes, I decided to head back. I wanted to make it to the car before dark. The trail was tricky enough in daylight. I didn't want to risk navigating it with just a flashlight. But as I stood up and shouldered my pack, I noticed something odd. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing. I shook it off. Forests have rhythms, I told myself. Sometimes they're loud, sometimes they're quiet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started back the way I'd come, moving faster than before. The trail was harder to follow on the return trip. The shadows were longer now, and the overgrown plants seemed to have shifted, obscuring the path. I pulled out my map to double-check, but it didn't make sense. According to the map, I should have been back at the fork by now, but the trail just kept winding deeper into the woods. My pulse quickened. I'd been hiking long enough to know that getting lost is easier than most people think. One wrong turn, one missed marker, and suddenly you're off the trail. I tried to calm myself. Panicking wouldn't help. I just retraced my steps until I found a familiar landmark. Except, there were no landmarks. No fallen trees, no distinctive rocks. Nothing to tell me I'd been here before. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself while I wasn't looking. I checked my compass. The needle spun lazily before settling in the wrong direction. I tapped it, shook it, but it didn't help. Something was interfering with it, maybe the dense canopy or minerals in the soil. Either way, it was useless. The sun was dipping lower in the sky now, its light turning a dull orange that filtered weakly through the trees. I pulled out my flashlight and kept moving. My footsteps sounded too loud in the unnatural silence, like an intruder crashing through someone else's home. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen, straining to hear anything. A bird, a breeze, even the distant roar of a plane overhead. But there was nothing. And then I did hear something. A soft crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. The sound had come from somewhere behind me. Slowly, I turned around, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam illuminated trunks and branches, but nothing else. No animals, no people, just forest. It's just a deer, I whispered to myself, or a raccoon, something small, harmless. But I didn't believe it. My instincts were screaming at me now, every nerve on high alert. I started walking again, faster this time, almost jogging. The trail was barely visible, but I didn't care. I just needed to keep moving. Another sound. This time it was a rustling, like leaves being brushed aside, closer than before. I whipped around, flashlight shaking in my hand, and scanned the trees again. Still nothing, but the feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost suffocating. I'd read stories about hikers being stalked by mountain lions or bears. I knew the rules: don't run, make yourself look big, make noise to scare them off. But this didn't feel like an animal. It felt deliberate, like whatever was out there was toying with me. I forced myself to keep walking, my legs trembling with every step. The forest seemed darker now, the trees crowding closer together. My flashlight cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. I tripped over a root and went down hard, scraping my palms and knees. My flashlight tumbled out of my hand and rolled a few feet away, its beam pointing uselessly at the ground. As I scrambled to grab it, I heard the sound again. This time it was unmistakable footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from somewhere behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the flashlight and spun around, shining it wildly into the trees. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer, just the sound of the wind picking up, rustling the leaves above me. I backed away, keeping the flashlight trained on the spot where I thought the footsteps had come from. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. Should I run? Hide? Stay and try to confront? Whatever it was, the footsteps came again, closer this time. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The flashlight bobbed wildly in my hand, its beam bouncing off the trees and underbrush. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get away. Branches clawed at my arms and face as I barreled through the forest. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The footsteps were behind me now, faster, matching my pace. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't letting me go. And then, suddenly, I broke through the trees and stumbled onto a gravel road. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. The forest loomed behind me, dark and silent. I scrambled to my feet and looked around. The road was empty, stretching out in both directions. There was no sign of anyone else. I didn't wait to catch my breath. I picked a direction and started walking, my legs shaking with every step. The road had to lead somewhere. It had to. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I saw headlights in the distance. Car was coming. I waved my arms frantically, stepping into the middle of the road to make sure they saw me. The car slowed to a stop, and the driver, an older man with a kind face, rolled down his window. "You okay, miss?" he asked, concern etched into his features. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He unlocked the passenger door, and I climbed in, collapsing into the seat. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest, its dark silhouette receding into the distance. I didn't see anyone or anything following us, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me long after the man dropped me off at a gas station with a working phone. I never found out what was in those woods that day. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was something worse. But one thing's for sure, I won't be hiking alone again anytime soon. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought the weekend getaway to the cabin would be the perfect escape. just a few days away from the noise of the city, a chance to relax and get some peace. The idea of nature, the mountains, and the isolation sounded ideal. I rented the cabin online, and I didn't think much about it. The photos showed a cozy, rustic place nestled deep in the woods, far enough from town to feel remote, but not so far that you couldn't get help if needed. The reviews were positive enough, quiet and peaceful. A great place to unwind. Perfect if you want to disconnect. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, following the GPS directions. The road became less paved the closer I got to the cabin. I could feel the car bouncing along the uneven terrain, and the trees around me started to grow thicker. The air smelled different here, cleaner, almost crisp, but also a little earthy. Something familiar, something wild. When I arrived, I saw the cabin for the first time. It was exactly as the pictures had shown. A small wooden structure with a porch that wrapped around the front. It was nestled against a hill, surrounded by trees that seemed to go on forever. There was no one around, not even other cabins nearby. Just a peaceful, quiet emptiness. It felt isolated, but not in a threatening way, at least not yet. I unloaded my things into the cabin and took in my surroundings. The inside was just as cozy as it appeared in the photos. Old wooden beams, a stone fireplace, mismatched furniture, and a large window at the back that looked out over a small creek. It was charming, no doubt about that. But the more I looked around, the more I realized how remote this place truly was. No neighbors, no cell service, no Wi-Fi. Just me, a few trees, and the sounds of birds and wind. I started a fire in the fireplace and settled into one of the chairs. I unpacked my bag, put on some music to fill the silence, and just let myself sink into the atmosphere. I was looking forward to having the whole weekend to myself. It was going to be great. The first evening passed uneventfully. I made dinner, read a book, and went to bed early, enjoying the feeling of being away from the world. But something strange happened as I lay there, drifting off to sleep. There was a noise. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper on the wind. I strained to hear it, unsure if it was just my imagination or something else. But then it became clearer, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I sat up in bed, straining to hear it. It was coming from somewhere outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the sound of tree branches scraping against the walls in the wind. But this was different. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too steady. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the woods. I peered out into the dark, scanning the trees. There was nothing there, just the shadows of branches swaying gently. The tapping stopped. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe the house was settling. I convinced myself that it was nothing, so I went back to bed and eventually fell asleep. But the tapping didn't stop there. The next morning, I woke up early and had breakfast by the fire. I spent the day outside, hiking through the woods, enjoying the solitude. There was a quiet beauty to the landscape, the way the trees stood tall and still, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves. It was peaceful, and it allowed me to let go of the stress that had built up in my life. For a while, it felt like everything was right, but by that evening, the feeling had shifted. I couldn't quite explain why, but there was something off about the cabin now. It wasn't the noise from the night before, though that still lingered in the back of my mind. It was more the air, the way the trees seemed to grow thicker as the light started to fade. The shadows felt longer, darker, and the silence, there was something unnerving about it. The wind had stopped, the birds had stopped singing, and it felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I tried to ignore the unease that was creeping up on me, so I decided to take another walk. Maybe it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my skin, and I breathed deeply, trying to clear my head. The sky was turning dark, the stars slowly emerging in the vastness above. I started walking toward the creek, hoping the sound of running water would calm my mind. But as I approached the water, I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing by the edge of the creek. It wasn't human, not really. It was too still, too rigid, and the way it stood with its back to me made my skin crawl. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its arms were stretched out at an odd angle, almost like it was reaching for something that I couldn't see. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and my instincts screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at this thing. I tried to tell myself that it was just a tree or a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I took a step back, slowly, trying not to make a sound. My hand trembled as I gripped the flashlight tighter, but before I could take another step, the figure turned. It wasn't a person, at least not in any way I could understand. Its face was a twisted mess, like something that had been half-formed and left to decay. The skin was pale and stretched too tight, its eyes black holes that seemed to absorb all light. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, just a horrible, gurgling noise. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran. My feet were clumsy, stumbling over rocks and branches as I sprinted back toward the cabin. I didn't dare look behind me, but I could feel it, whatever that thing was, following me, getting closer with each step. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing against me, trying to drag me down. My heart pounded in my chest, and I thought for sure I wouldn't make it back. But somehow I did. I burst through the door of the cabin, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against it, breathless and shaking. I checked the locks, all of them, and then I sat on the floor, trying to calm myself down. My mind was racing. Had I imagined it? Was it just the isolation playing tricks on me? But the feeling, the fear, those were real. I knew what I had seen. That night, the tapping returned. I tried to block it out, to ignore it, but it was no use. It was louder now, closer. Came from all directions. The roof, the walls, the windows. It was like the cabin itself was alive, pulsing with the rhythm of the tapping. I could hear it even through the thick walls, tapping and scraping, like fingers dragging along the wood. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and made a decision. I was leaving. I didn't care what time it was. I didn't care how far the drive was. I just needed to get out of there. As I started the car, I looked back at the cabin one last time. The windows were dark, but I swear I saw something moving in the shadows. I didn't wait to find out what it was. The road felt endless as I drove, my headlights cutting through the darkness. The further I got from the cabin, the lighter I felt, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. It was late, but I found a small motel and checked in. The woman behind the counter looked at me strangely, but I didn't care. I just needed a bed, some peace. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Couldn't. They wouldn't believe me. But I know what I saw, and I'll never go back to that cabin. I don't know what was out there, but I know it wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could explain. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night trying to sleep, I can still hear the tapping. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It's out there. I'm not sure why I thought it would be a good idea to head to the cabin alone. Maybe it was the promise of peace and quiet, a chance to clear my head. Life in the city had been overwhelming lately, and the idea of disconnecting from everything sounded like the perfect remedy. So, when my friend offered me the use of his family's remote cabin in the woods, I jumped at the opportunity. The drive out there was uneventful, though the roads became narrower and more desolate the further I went. Trees lined the path on both sides, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. My GPS lost signal about 20 minutes before I arrived, but the instructions my friend had given me were straightforward. Turn left at the old wooden sign, drive 3 miles down the dirt road, and there it was. The cabin itself was modest, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. It looked like something out of a postcard. A simple wooden structure with a slanted roof, a small porch, and a single chimney. There was a shed a few yards away, which I assumed held tools or firewood. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil. It was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and made my way inside. The interior was cozy but dated. The living room had a stone fireplace, a worn-out couch, and a wooden coffee table. The kitchen was small but functional, with a gas stove, a mini fridge, and shelves stocked with canned goods and dry food. There was one bedroom and a bathroom, everything I needed for a short getaway. After unpacking, I decided to explore the area. The woods were dense, the trees towering and ancient. A narrow path wound its way through the forest, and I followed it for a while. The sounds of the forest surrounded me. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional crack of a branch, the distant call of a bird. It was peaceful, but there was an underlying sense of isolation that was hard to ignore. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I told myself it was just my imagination. As the sun began to set, I made my way back to the cabin. The temperature dropped quickly, and I was glad for the stack of firewood by the fireplace. I started a fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled into the couch with a book. The crackling of the fire was comforting, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly relaxed. The first night passed without incident. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of birdsong. After breakfast, I decided to venture further into the woods. I brought a map my friend had left in the cabin, which marked a few points of interest: a small stream, an old hunting tower, and a clearing with a great view of the surrounding hills. I planned to visit all three. The stream was easy to find, its clear water bubbling over smooth stones. I spent some time there enjoying the tranquility. The hunting tower was less inviting. It was old and rickety, its wooden beams weathered and splintered. I climbed it anyway, the structure creaking with every step. From the top, I had a decent view of the forest, though the thick canopy obscured much of the ground below. I didn't stay long. The clearing was the furthest point, and getting there was more challenging than I expected. The trail became less defined, and I had to push through dense underbrush. When I finally arrived, the view was worth it. The hills stretched out before me, the forest a sea of green that seemed endless. I stayed for a while, taking it all in before starting back. It was on the way back that things began to feel off. The forest seemed quieter than before. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. I quickened my pace, trying to shake the unease that was settling over me. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. I'd spent too much time in the city, where silence was rare. Out here, it was probably normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint at first, just the occasional crack of a branch or rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone was walking around the cabin. I stayed in bed, my heart pounding, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and methodical. They stopped by the front porch, and I held my breath, waiting. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before the footsteps moved away and disappeared into the woods. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt around the cabin. They weren't animal tracks, they were boot prints. Someone had been out there. I tried to convince myself it was a hiker who'd wandered too close, but deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. The cabin was too remote. I spent the day inside, uneasy and on edge. I kept the doors locked and stayed near the fireplace, where I felt safest. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself that I'd overreacted. Maybe the tracks had been there before I arrived, and I just hadn't noticed. That night, the sounds returned. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. They banged on the walls of the cabin, rattled the doorknob, and stomped across the porch. I sat in the living room, clutching a fireplace poker, my heart racing. The banging continued for what felt like an eternity before everything went silent. I didn't sleep. When dawn broke, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things and loaded them into the car. As I walked to the driver's side, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the wooden door of the cabin were the words, "Leave now." I didn't need to be told twice. I got in the car and drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a motel and spent the night there, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, I called my friend to tell him what had happened. He seemed genuinely shocked and apologized profusely, insisting that nothing like this had ever happened before. He promised to look into it and let me know if he found anything, but I told him I didn't want to know. I just wanted to put the whole experience behind me. I never went back to that cabin, and I've avoided remote places ever since. Whatever or whoever was out there that night, I'm just glad I listened to the warning and left. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. The silence in the middle of nowhere was suffocating. I'd been driving for hours, the sun long set, the road ahead lit only by the faint beams from my headlights. My car hummed steadily, and the tires on the cracked asphalt made a constant sound. It was the only thing breaking the eerie quiet of the vast, empty countryside. Around me, nothing but fields stretched in every direction. No signs of life, no houses, no lights. It felt like I was the last person on Earth. I hadn't planned on being out here. The road I was on wasn't even on my map. I was just trying to get back home after visiting a friend, and somewhere along the way, I took a wrong turn, and here I was. There had been no towns, no exits, just miles of nothing. I wasn't scared. I mean, not exactly. I was a little unsettled, sure, but more out of frustration than fear. The thought of having to find a place to turn around and retrace my steps didn't sit well with me. But I kept going. The GPS on my phone was dead. No surprise there. I hadn't seen a signal for miles, and I didn't even know which direction I was going anymore. The radio was filled with static. No one was out here. No one at all. It wasn't like I hadn't been on back roads before, but this felt different, more isolating. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the task at hand. Just keep driving, just get out of this place. Then I saw the lights. They were small at first, just a faint flicker ahead, probably a house in the distance. I felt a small sense of relief. Maybe there was someone out here, someone to ask for directions. Maybe I could even stretch my legs and get a bit of a break from the monotonous drive. As I neared, the lights didn't get any brighter. They didn't seem like the kind of lights you would see coming from a house or a gas station. Instead, they were dim and odd, faint, yellowish glows that seemed to flicker and pulse unnaturally. I slowed the car down as I got closer, instinct telling me to be cautious. The road up ahead was no longer a smooth stretch of blacktop, but a rough, gravel path that looked like it had seen better days. The flickering lights were coming from some kind of shack or small building off the side of the road. There was no sign indicating it was a business or a home, just a decrepit structure, barely visible through the fog that had begun to roll in. The building itself was old, the wood dark and cracked, and I could barely make out the outline of what looked like an old pickup truck parked nearby. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't just keep driving without checking. So, I pulled off the road and parked by the edge of the gravel path, shutting off my engine. The hum of the car died down immediately, leaving the world even quieter. I could hear the distant rustling of the wind and, in the background, what I swore was the faintest sound of someone, moving inside the shack. I hesitated for a moment, sitting there in the car with my hand still on the door handle. I could leave. It was probably safer to just keep going until I found a real town. But curiosity gnawed at me. Something told me that if I didn't at least see what was going on, I might regret it later. So, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the building. As I moved closer, I could hear the creaking of the wooden structure and the sound of someone humming. A low, eerie tune that seemed to echo in the cold air. It was a man's voice, but it didn't sound human in the way I expected. It was like someone trying to remember how to hum, but failing miserably. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I pushed through. The door to the shack was ajar, just enough to let a sliver of light escape from the inside. I stopped just before the threshold and called out, "Hello!" My voice cracked in the stillness. No response, just the humming. I pushed the door open slightly more and peered inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was a mix of something rotting and a faint scent of metal, like old rusted tools. My stomach churned, and I stepped back, trying not to breathe too deeply. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There was a man sitting at a small, rickety table in the center of the room. His back was to me, but I could see him clearly now. He was hunched over, his hands moving as if he was working on something, though I couldn't tell what. His clothes were torn and tattered, and his hair, long and greasy, hung down over his face. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't even move, but he kept humming that strange, off-key melody, louder now, like he didn't care I was standing there. I wasn't sure what to do. My instinct told me to leave, but I had to know what he was doing. Why was he here in the middle of nowhere in a shack like this? I stepped forward, and the floorboard creaked loudly under my foot. That's when he stopped humming. I froze. The silence that followed was worse than anything. The air felt thick, oppressive, like something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Slowly, the man turned his head toward me, but he didn't stand. He just looked over his shoulder with eyes that seemed too wide, too intense. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was like we were frozen in time. His gaze was unsettling, almost too calm for someone who looked like they hadn't seen another soul in years. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat, without emotion. I shook my head, feeling the tight knot in my throat. "I'm just lost. I need directions." The man didn't respond. Instead, he stood up slowly and walked toward a table cluttered with all sorts of strange, discarded objects. Old papers, empty cans, and what looked like broken electronics. He muttered something under his breath, though it didn't sound like words, just sounds. Then he stopped at the edge of the table, picked something up, and turned back to face me. It was a knife, a long, sharp-looking knife, and his hand gripped it too tightly, like he was about to do something with it. I immediately took a step back. My mind raced as I thought about what to do. Something was wrong here. This man wasn't right. The fear I'd been suppressing hit me all at once. I turned to leave, but the man stepped toward me, blocking the door. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice colder now. I didn't answer, couldn't. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized how much danger I was in. The door was the only way out, but it was blocked. The man kept staring at me, his eyes like two dark holes in his face. There was something about him, something off, like he wasn't quite human anymore. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it deep in my gut. I turned on my heel and ran for the window at the back of the shack, the glass rattling as I shoved it open. The cold night air hit me in the face, and I jumped out onto the ground, scrambling to my feet as fast as I could. Behind me, I heard the sound of the man's boots hitting the floor, but I didn't stop. I ran as hard as I could, not daring to look back. It felt like forever before I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, finally managing to unlock the door. I jumped in, started the engine, and peeled out of there, my heart still racing. In the rearview mirror, I saw the shack disappear into the distance, swallowed up by the darkness. I didn't look back. I never should have gone on that hike alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me, my boots, and the mountains. I had been planning it for weeks, thinking that some solitude in the wild would be the perfect escape from the stress of work and city life. I chose a trail that wasn't too well known, the kind of place where you could feel like you were the only person on Earth, the perfect way to recharge. The morning I left, the weather was clear, a bit chilly, but nothing out of the ordinary. The trailhead was just off the main road, and as I parked my car, I was met with the usual mix of excitement and nervousness that comes with starting something new. I checked my pack one more time, making sure I had everything: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map. I knew the trail, at least the general layout of it, so I didn't expect to get lost. Still, I always like to be prepared. I locked the car and set off, breathing in the fresh, crisp air. The trail started out easy, winding through thick trees, their leaves already starting to turn amber for the fall. The air smelled earthy, like damp soil and pine. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching on the gravel path and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first few miles were nothing unusual. The trail dipped down into a small valley, following a creek that twisted through the trees. It was quiet, with just the sound of water flowing over rocks and the occasional bird call overhead. I stopped a few times to take pictures, admiring the landscape, but each time I looked around, something seemed off. The woods felt dense, too dense. The trees crowded in on me, their gnarled branches reaching out as if trying to grab me. I shrugged it off, though. It was just my imagination, I thought. About halfway through the hike, the trail became steeper, leading up toward a rocky ridge. I had read that the view from the top was breathtaking, and that's what kept me going. My legs were starting to feel the burn, but I welcomed the physical challenge. I was in good shape, and this was exactly what I needed to clear my head. That's when I noticed something strange. I'd been walking for hours, and the trail was starting to feel unfamiliar. The path was narrowing, becoming more overgrown. The usual trail markers were sparse, and I started to wonder if I had missed a turn somewhere. I checked my map, but it didn't seem to match up with what I was seeing. The contours of the land were wrong. I couldn't figure it out. I stood there for a moment trying to get my bearings. The air around me seemed to grow heavier, the sounds of nature dimming as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided to press on, hoping the trail would open up again. But it didn't. It just got worse. The path became more and more difficult to follow, the ground uneven and slippery from the morning dew. I found myself scrambling over rocks and fallen branches, my heart rate picking up as the trail seemed to disappear entirely. At this point, I started to feel genuinely uneasy. It was as if the forest had closed in around me, trapping me in a maze with no way out. I should have turned back then. The thought crossed my mind, but something kept me going. Maybe it was the idea of the view at the top, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I just didn't want to admit that I had gotten myself into a situation I couldn't handle. I kept moving, pushing through the underbrush and ignoring the creeping sense of dread building in the pit of my stomach. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. The trees seemed to loom over me, their twisted branches casting long, eerie shadows in the fading light. The air was thick, almost suffocating. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion anymore. There was something else, something wrong. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a cliff, the rocks jutting out sharply toward the sky. It was a view, but not the one I had been expecting. The mountain peak was still out of reach, and the dense forest stretched endlessly behind me. The silence was oppressive, and it was as though the entire world had stopped. I looked around, trying to get a sense of where I was, but everything seemed unfamiliar. That's when I realized I had made a mistake. I'd taken the wrong path. Somehow, I had wandered off the main trail into an area that was rarely visited. I had no idea how far I had gone or where I was in relation to the trailhead. My phone had no signal, of course. I felt a wave of panic rush over me. This wasn't just a missed turn or a minor detour. I was lost, and worse, I was alone. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting everything in a cold, golden light. The woods felt different in the fading light, darker, more threatening. I knew I had to get out of there before it got completely dark, but the thought of retracing my steps felt impossible. The trail was barely visible now, and with every step I took, the dense forest seemed to swallow me whole. I started moving again, hoping to find some sign of the trail or any recognizable landmarks. But the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. I tried to remember my surroundings, any distinctive features of the landscape that might help me find my way back, but everything looked the same. Trees, rocks, more trees. Nothing stood out. I began to feel the weight of panic rising in my chest. My heart was pounding in my ears. I couldn't keep moving like this. I needed to stop and think. I found a small clearing and sat down on a rock, trying to steady my breathing. I pulled out my map again, but it was useless. I couldn't make sense of it anymore. It was as if the landscape itself had shifted, become something I didn't recognize. As the light faded, the forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the chill of the night air sank into my bones. I realized I had to make a decision. Stay put and hope someone would come looking for me, or keep moving and risk getting even more lost. I opted for the latter. It felt like my only option. I picked a direction and forced myself to walk. The darkness pressed in on me like a weight, and I stumbled over roots and rocks in the growing gloom. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a ghost or some supernatural presence. It was just the primal instinct that tells you when you're being watched. Couldn't explain it, but I felt it deeply. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it, a light. It was faint at first, just a small glow in the distance, but it was enough to give me hope. I hurried toward it, my legs burning, my breath shallow and fast. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a campfire or someone else's flashlight. It was the last remnants of daylight, barely visible through a break in the trees. And just beyond that break, I saw the trail. A small sign, barely visible in the dim light, marked the turnoff to the main trail. I followed it without hesitation, my legs shaky but driven by the overwhelming need to get out of the woods. I kept my focus on the trail, ignoring the growing darkness around me, until finally, after what felt like hours, I made it back to the main path. Relief flooded through me, so intense that it almost brought me to my knees. I looked around, the familiar trees and rocks no longer feeling ominous but like old friends. I knew exactly where I was now. The end of the trail was just a few miles away. By the time I reached the trailhead, the stars were out, and the night air was crisp and cool. My car was waiting for me, a beacon of safety. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. I just got in, started the engine, and drove off without another thought. I don't know what exactly happened out there, but I know I'll never go hiking alone again. It was a harsh reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, how easily you can become lost in a place that's supposed to be peaceful. That forest isn't some tranquil escape. It's a place that can swallow you whole if you're not careful. And as I drove away, one thought kept repeating in my head. I was lucky. Next time, I might not be. I never expected a weekend getaway to turn into something I'd never be able to forget. I'm not one for horror stories or anything supernatural, but something happened that weekend that rattled me to my core. And it all started with a cabin, one that I'd found online, tucked away in the woods. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat.
No distractions.
No city noise, just me, my thoughts, and nature. The perfect escape from the grind. The cabin was small, rustic, the kind of place that promised a full immersion in nature. It wasn't far from town, just a couple of hours, tucked off the beaten path, hidden among tall trees and winding dirt roads. The journey up wasn't as smooth as I'd hoped. The GPS led me down a bumpy dirt road that grew narrower and rougher the further I went. The trees around me seemed to close in, their towering trunks like silent sentinels, blocking out much of the sun. It was peaceful at first. I loved how the forest seemed to swallow all the noise of the world. But as the hours passed, I began to wonder if I'd gone too far off course. I kept driving, past isolated patches of trees, until I saw the cabin. It was a small, weather-beaten building made of dark wood, sitting alone among a small clearing. At first glance, it looked quaint, exactly like the pictures on the website. A porch with a couple of old rocking chairs, a small chimney puffing out a faint trail of smoke, and a backdrop of dense woods. I parked the car and stepped out into the quiet. The air was fresh but cool, and the silence was almost suffocating. There were no birds chirping, no animals scurrying about. Nothing. Just the wind whispering through the leaves. It struck me as odd but not unsettling. I chalked it up to being deep in the woods. I grabbed my bag from the car and made my way to the front door. The key was hidden under a small rock beside the door, just like the instructions had said. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was as rustic as the outside, with a heavy, earthy smell that filled my nostrils. Old wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, and the furniture was mismatched but comfortable. A couch, a couple of armchairs, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen area were all in place. A large window in the living room overlooked the woods, and I couldn't help but feel a slight sense of unease as I gazed at the dense forest outside. I dropped my bag and settled in, unpacking my things and making myself a cup of coffee. There was a note on the kitchen counter from the property owner, welcoming me and giving a few instructions about the cabin. The message was short and friendly, but it didn't mention much about the surrounding area. No directions to nearby towns, no suggestions for things to do. Just a simple enjoy your stay and a list of emergency contact numbers. I didn't think much of it and decided to take a walk around the property. The woods surrounding the cabin seemed almost impenetrable. The trees were thick, their trunks gnarled and twisted in ways that made me feel like they were watching me. It was strange how the forest felt so alive, but not in a welcoming way. The air had a damp chill, and the silence hung heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed, though I saw nothing but trees and leaves. I returned to the cabin, deciding to settle in for the night. It was just me, alone in this isolated spot. There was no TV, no phone signal, no internet, just the fire crackling in the fireplace and the quiet outside. It should have been peaceful. It should have been exactly what I wanted. But as the night drew on, I started to hear things. It started with a faint tapping sound. Soft at first, like someone was knocking on the door. But when I checked, the porch was empty. The woods outside were still. There was nothing but the wind, but even that seemed unnaturally quiet. I shrugged it off as a branch brushing against the cabin, something harmless. The tapping continued throughout the evening, becoming more distinct as the hours passed. It sounded like it was coming from the walls, the roof, or perhaps somewhere underneath the cabin. I tried to ignore it, but every now and then, I'd hear a faint scrape, followed by that same gentle knock. It was driving me mad. Around midnight, I heard a louder sound. It came from outside this time, something heavy scraping against the wood. I jumped up from my seat, my heart racing. I didn't want to go out there. I didn't want to look, but I had to know what it was. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cold, and the silence was even more oppressive than before. I shone the flashlight into the woods, scanning the darkness. The beam caught only trees and the occasional rustling of leaves. There was nothing except the sound, the unmistakable scraping sound, like something large was dragging along the ground. It was coming from the far side of the cabin, from the tree line. I felt my pulse quicken. The woods seemed to close in, and for the first time I felt real fear. I decided to get inside. Fast. I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut, hoping that whatever it was would stay outside. The sound continued for a few more minutes before it finally stopped. But then, something else happened. I could feel it, a presence, like someone was standing just outside the cabin, watching me through the walls. I tried to convince myself that it was just my nerves. After all, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. My mind was probably playing tricks on me. But then I heard something even worse. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They circled around the cabin, scraping across the wooden floor, getting closer to the door. I held my breath, my body frozen with fear. The steps stopped right outside the window next to the door. I could see nothing, but I could hear the slow, steady rhythm of the footsteps. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight, but I knew it wouldn't help. Whatever was outside wasn't something I could fight. The steps moved around the cabin again, then stopped. For a moment, there was absolute silence. And then nothing. The footsteps disappeared. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring at the walls, too scared to sleep, too scared to move. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I dozed off in the armchair, my eyes darting open every few minutes, checking the windows, the door. But nothing came back. When morning came, I was exhausted but relieved. The sun had risen, and the world seemed normal again.
No footsteps, no strange sounds.
It was as if the night's events had been a dream, but I knew it wasn't. I felt it. I'd heard it. I didn't want to leave the cabin. I didn't want to drive away from whatever that thing was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting for me to leave so it could follow me. After packing my things in a rush, I drove back down the same winding road, the trees watching me as I left. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if I was just overtired, or if there was something out there in those woods. All I know is that I won't be going back to that cabin. Not now. Not ever. The woods may have been quiet when I left, but I could feel it. Something was still there, waiting for the next person to come. It had been a long week at work, and the idea of escaping to the woods for the weekend seemed like the perfect remedy. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks. No distractions, no cell service, just the peace of nature. A few friends had offered to join, but I preferred solitude. It felt better to be alone, away from everything and everyone, to recharge and find clarity. I arrived at the park in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dense trees. The air had that crispness to it, the kind that made you take a deep breath and feel alive. I drove to the spot where I had planned to set up camp, far enough from the main trail but not so isolated that I'd feel uneasy. Just the right balance. I had a tent, a hammock, and the basic supplies: food, water, a first aid kit, and my trusty knife. Everything I needed to get by. The campsite was nestled between a small creek and a towering ridge. The sound of rushing water from the creek was soothing, and I figured it would be the perfect background noise for the night. I started setting up my tent, unpacking my gear with methodical precision. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in soft beams, giving everything an ethereal glow. By the time I had everything in place, the sun had nearly set. I built a fire, watching the flames crackle and dance. The warmth felt good against the cool evening air. I ate my dinner, simple but satisfying, and settled into my hammock afterward, enjoying the serenity. But something was off. It wasn't the usual peaceful stillness of the woods. There was a slight tension in the air. The sounds of birds and insects had died down, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, I was out here alone. I grabbed a book from my bag to distract myself, but the unease lingered. A few hours later, as the moon climbed high in the sky, I decided it was time to turn in. The night was too quiet. I zipped myself into my tent, the fabric thin and reassuring, the sound of the wind rustling the leaves outside. Just as I was about to close my eyes, I heard something. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling in the underbrush. I held my breath, straining to listen. The rustling continued, growing louder, as if something was moving around my camp. My heart began to beat faster. I knew there were animals in the area, deer, squirrels, maybe a bear, but this didn't sound like the usual wildlife. This was deliberate, methodical, the sound of something or someone moving closer. I stayed completely still, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The rustling stopped, but I didn't relax. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the tent's entrance. Nothing. I couldn't see anything, but the silence was suffocating. Maybe it was just an animal, but the rational part of my brain couldn't ignore the oddness of it. It felt too purposeful, too coordinated. I waited for what seemed like hours, but eventually, the noises stopped. I let out a shaky breath, convinced I was just being paranoid. I turned off the flashlight and tried to sleep, telling myself that everything was fine. The next morning, I woke up with the sun. I felt drained, as if I hadn't slept at all. The events of the previous night were still fresh in my mind. I checked my camp, but everything seemed normal. My tent was untouched, my fire pit cold, my food bag where I left it. No signs of animals or anything out of the ordinary. I decided to hike for a while, hoping the exercise would clear my mind. The trail took me deeper into the forest, away from the camp. The woods were beautiful, full of towering trees and colorful autumn leaves. But even as I marveled at the scenery, that feeling of being watched never quite left me. After a few hours, I made my way back to the campsite. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The area around my camp was disturbed. The ground had been dug up in several places, the dirt overturned in a way that didn't look natural. My heart began to race. I knelt down and examined the marks. They weren't animal tracks, too large and too deliberate. Something had been digging around my campsite, and it wasn't a bear or a raccoon. I searched the area, feeling more exposed than ever. The woods, which had seemed so inviting at first, now felt ominous. My nerves were frayed, and the weight of the previous night's events hung over me like a dark cloud. I checked my supplies. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the rest of the day pacing around, trying to stay busy, trying to stay alert. The sun dipped below the horizon, and I knew night was coming again. The fear from last night gnawed at me, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I didn't want to be the person who left just because of a few odd noises. I made another fire and sat by it, my mind racing. That's when I heard it again. The same rustling sound from the night before, this time closer, more pronounced. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the flashlight in my hand. I scanned the dark perimeter of my camp, but saw nothing. Then, there was a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd heard before, came from the trees just outside my camp. I froze, not daring to move. My mind raced through possible explanations. An animal? Person? But none of them felt right. The growl was too deep, too unnatural. I grabbed my knife and moved to the edge of the firelight. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a series of loud, quick footsteps. Something moving fast. It wasn't an animal, I was sure of it. My hands trembled, and I could hear the sound of my own breath, shallow and panicked. I didn't wait to see what it was. I grabbed my pack, shoved my gear into it as quickly as I could, and unzipped the tent. Without thinking, I bolted. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out of there. I ran through the woods, the ground uneven beneath my feet, the trees blurring past. The growls continued, always just behind me, like a predator stalking its prey. My mind screamed for me to stop, to take a breath, but I couldn't. I pushed on, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't know how long I ran. The dark forest seemed endless, the growls never fading, always in pursuit. My legs burned, my chest ached for air, but I kept running. Then, as suddenly as it began, the growling stopped. The air was thick with silence, and the only sound was the frantic beating of my heart. I slowed to a stop, my body trembling with exhaustion. I could barely see in the dark, but I knew I had to keep moving. I needed to find shelter, safety. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a ranger's cabin. One of those old, abandoned structures meant for emergencies. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I collapsed to the floor, too tired to stand. The growls were gone, but the fear hadn't left me. I spent the rest of the night in the cabin, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to even move. When morning came, I didn't wait. I left the cabin and walked back to the main road, hitching a ride to the nearest town. The woods, the camp, everything felt like a distant nightmare. I never went back to that place. Looking back, I can't explain what happened. I've tried to make sense of it in the years since, but nothing fits. There was no clear danger, no visible threat, but the terror I felt was real. Some things in nature, I believe, aren't meant to be understood. I've always enjoyed hiking, but I've never been what you'd call an expert. Most of the trails I've explored have been well-marked paths, the kind where you see a ranger's hut at the entrance and a map board with clearly labeled routes. That's why, when I decided to challenge myself with a more remote trail in the mountains, I thought I was ready. I brought water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a printed map I downloaded online. It was supposed to be a day hike, a step outside my comfort zone, but nothing too extreme. The idea of solitude appealed to me, the chance to escape the noise of everyday life. The trail started easy, a gentle slope weaving through tall pines. The air was cool, and the forest smelled of earth and pine needles. I followed the markers nailed to trees, orange squares that stood out against the green. The sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze were the only noises. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. I took my time, stopping to snap pictures of moss-covered rocks and little streams cutting through the undergrowth. The trouble started when I decided to take what I thought was a shortcut. I'd reached a fork in the trail where the map wasn't entirely clear. One path seemed to climb sharply uphill, while the other meandered into denser woods. The markers were harder to spot here, and I convinced myself that the uphill trail couldn't be right. It felt too steep for a route marked as moderate difficulty. So, I veered onto the other path, certain it would loop back to the main trail eventually. First, it seemed fine. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in a thick layer of pine needles. I noticed fewer markers but assumed they'd appear soon. After about 30 minutes, though, doubt began to creep in. The path wasn't as defined anymore, more like a deer trail than a hiking route. Branches clawed at my arms, and the trees grew so close together that the sunlight barely filtered through. I checked my map but couldn't pinpoint exactly where I was. I decided to backtrack, but that proved harder than expected. The way I'd come was no longer obvious. Trails in the forest can vanish if you're not paying attention, blending into the surrounding terrain. I tried retracing my steps but kept hitting dead ends or finding myself in unfamiliar spots. My heart began to race as I realized I was officially lost. I told myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help. I remembered reading that if you're lost, the best thing to do is stop moving and assess your situation. So, I sat on a fallen log, pulled out my water bottle, and tried to think logically. I still had daylight left, though the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. My phone had no signal, as expected in such a remote area. I decided to pick a direction and stick to it, reasoning that walking downhill would eventually lead to a stream or road. The forest grew thicker as I descended, the undergrowth turning into a tangle of ferns and thorny bushes. My legs started to ache from stepping over fallen branches and uneven ground. I checked my watch. An hour had passed, and I was no closer to finding my way out. As the sun began to set, the woods took on a different character. The cheerful birdsong faded, replaced by the occasional crack of a branch or rustle in the bushes. Every sound made me jump, my mind conjuring images of bears or mountain lions. I knew they were unlikely to attack a human, but the knowledge did little to calm my nerves. I needed to find a place to spend the night, as continuing in the dark would only increase my chances of injury. I found a relatively flat spot beneath a large tree and cleared away the leaves and twigs. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I had no tent or sleeping bag, just the clothes on my back and a lightweight jacket. The temperature dropped quickly after sundown, and I shivered as I huddled against the tree trunk. The forest was alive with noises I couldn't identify, each one amplifying my unease. Sleep was impossible. I kept my small flashlight off to conserve the battery, using it sparingly to check my surroundings. When morning finally came, I was stiff and exhausted but relieved to see daylight. I resumed my descent, hoping to stumble upon a stream. Water often leads to signs of civilization, or so I'd read. My water bottle was nearly empty, and I rationed the remaining sips carefully. Hunger gnawed at me, but I had only a handful of trail mix left. Hours passed, and my hope began to waver. I slipped on a mossy rock and scraped my knee, blood soaking through my pants. I tore a strip from my shirt to bandage it, cursing my decision to take that supposed shortcut. I hadn't seen any sign of a stream or human presence, just endless trees and more trees. By the third day, I was desperate. Dehydration had set in, my throat dry and my head pounding. I stumbled upon a muddy patch of ground with animal tracks leading to a small puddle. The water was murky, but I had no choice. I used my shirt to strain it as best I could before drinking. Tasted awful, but gave me the strength to keep moving. On the fourth day, I found an old logging road. It was overgrown, barely distinguishable from the forest floor, but it was something. I followed it, hoping it would lead somewhere. My legs felt like lead, every step a monumental effort. I hadn't eaten in over a day, and my thoughts grew hazy. I wondered if anyone was looking for me, if I'd ever make it out. Finally, I heard the distant hum of an engine. The sound was faint but unmistakable. I stumbled toward it, tears streaming down my face. A truck appeared around a bend, and the driver's eyes widened when he saw me. He stopped, jumped out, and helped me into the cab. I was too weak to explain much, but he understood enough to know I needed help. He gave me water and a protein bar, and I devoured them like a starving animal. The driver took me to the nearest town, where I was treated for dehydration and exhaustion. The experience left me shaken, but it also taught me a hard lesson about preparation and respect for the wilderness. I still enjoy hiking, but I've never attempted anything that remote again. Now, I stick to marked trails, carry a GPS device, and always tell someone where I'm going. The forest is beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. I'll never forget how close I came to being another cautionary tale.